Prime Minister. Prime Minister, here.
Am I audible and visible?
Yes.
All right. Just a few seconds. Let me set up my timer. Pentecostalism is a massive barrier to religious access and progressivization. We'll prove that in our case, and we'll weigh this argument very strongly. 2 points of setup, though. Firstly, what does this rise look like? First of all, we think that this necessarily means the replacement of Christian identity. This is because, first of all, it's literally in the info slide that this challenges religious identities, for example, from Christian people. But second of all, because they have conflicting models and ideologies. So, for example, in Christian, you have churches, you have a certain degree and a large degree of, for example, centralization, whereas this model does not. So because the values are intrinsically contrasting and conflicting, this necessarily means the replacement of Christian identities and ideologies, or at least the heavy suppression of such identities. Second of all, this manifests in terms of three levels. Firstly, at the grassroots level, people are just generally more willing to embrace Pentecostalism. Second of all, at educational and, like community institutions, people are more likely to, spread this ideology through, for example, doctrine and stuff. And thirdly, in actual institutions, there are less institutions for example, Christian identity. That's what's going to happen on their side of the house that they need to defend. Second of all, regarding counterfactual, we think that the most likely counterfactual in this debate is that Christianity remains, right? So Catholicism remains on our side of the house. It grows through the same mechanisms of, for example, grassroots institutions, of educational institutions, of actual institutions, namely churches and other types of communities. Two claims then from opening government. The first is on religious access and the second is on progressivization. First of all, let's talk about religious access. The problem with opposition is fourfold. First of all, there's a massive psychological harm insofar as people are unable to access a certain definition of God. We think that this isn't a problem for older people who have had a long relationship with God, for instance. But for younger people who is, for example, 10 or 20 years old, who have not had such a large experience, who have not relied on God for example, moral guidance, for these people, they newly join the religion and they do not have anything that can guide them. The problem with opposition is that people just let them be because there is a common tendency among, for example, parents and, for example, among religious leaders these people are just going to be fine. These people are like fine, like they're just going to find a relationship with God. So they don't actually guide them. The problem with these individuals then is that they have a very uncertain relationship with God. You don't know whether or not you're doing the right thing. You don't know whether or not you're going to heaven. You don't know whether or not you're doing the right thing that is going to take you to the right place. There is a
Clarification.
massive psychological harm on their side of the house. Second of all, we think that there's just more conflict and friction within the region. I know what they're going to say. They're going to tell you that people know that we can have vastly different conceptions of God and conceptions of religion. There are two problems. First of all, people are not perfectly rational on either side of the house. So on the other side of the house, when you see that other people have vastly different, for example, conceptions of God, you still feel kind of offended, especially because secondly, these values can be very, very conflicting. For example, person A can say that God is telling them to do a certain thing. Person B can say that no, it's actually not that thing, it's actually a different thing. And because you have such an intimate relationship with God in the first place, the problem on their side of the house then is that you feel like the other person is conceptualizing God in a very wrong way, that is insulting to you, for instance. So we say that there's just more conflict and there's more friction. This not only increases the psychological harm on their side of the house, I'll take you later, but it also means that people are less likely to create communities. Third of all, I think that it's just easier to leverage religions in very bad ways because we think that leaders, for example, religious leaders and stuff, are going to occur on either side of the house. The problem is that on either side of the house, no, I mean not religious leaders, but actually like leaders and families and stuff, right? The problem is that on that side of the house, if they have really bad incentives, they can tie it down and they can justify it using things such as, oh, God tells me to do this, and you cannot tell me otherwise because God is fucking telling me to do this thing specifically because I have a personal experience with God. So the problem is that they just have a really, really convenient excuse to drop into when they do really bad things, for example, for people. But fourthly, we think that in terms of community creation in general, insofar as you have a vastly different conception of God, what the higher power in the world is, it is very difficult for you to, for example, collectivize, for example, very hard for you to create communities. So I think that on their side of the house, even if they say that they can create other communities, those communities are often less valuable and less sustainable. So for example, they create communities based on capitalistic pressures, you still compete with each other on that basis, for instance, so it's not actually really, really valuable as a community. The comparative on opposition then, on opening government then, is further, we reverse all these harms, right? First of all, regarding the psychological harm of not being able to access God, we just have churches, we just have people who can lead you, who can guide you towards a certain conception of God. Even if it's not the perfect conception, you don't know that, so you don't have the psychological harm on our side of the house. But second of all, we have less conflicts and restriction, because even if people can have somewhat different conceptions, those conceptions are not so vastly different as they are in life experiences, because they still have a common doctrine, they still have a common God that they can tend to. Third of all, we think that it's harder to leverage religions in very bad ways, because you have a common doctrine to refer to. It's harder to excuse yourself because everyone knows the teachings of God. Fourth of all, we think that we just have easier community creation simply because we don't, simply because we have a common thing that we can believe into, rather than having to opt into things such as capitalistic pressures. If on both sides of the house people have to opt into things such as capitalistic pressures, such as other types of pressures, at least on our side of the house, we have a more universal and more absolute way that we can create communities. That's just better. Before I get into progressivization, CO.
So per info slide, both religions are Christian, both have churches, thus both have access to God. What are the exact differences you're talking about?
I think that there's just less exploitation on outside the house because, as I've mentioned, there's a doctrine that you can kind of tend to, and you can refer to if someone is exploiting you in very wrong ways. But even if that's not true, there are other layers as well. But let's talk about progressivization. Opposition is bad in at least four major ways. First of all, regarding women's and minorities' rights. Notice that the info slide literally explicitly states things such as moral conservatism that implies that there are going to be things such as traditional gender roles. We think that's just generally bad. It's very intuitively bad. If, for example, women are forced into household roles, they have to wash dishes, they have to do these types of things. They're beaten up by their husbands, for instance. We think that's just really, really bad in general. It's also bad for other types of minorities, for example, gender minorities, such as LGBTQ people, because conservative people intuitively have more resources after centuries and decades of oppression. So on their side of the house, just gets a lot more oppression of the most vulnerable people that we should care about. Second of all, regarding medical access, notice that the info slide tells you things such as, like divine healing, which obviously doesn't work, right? So three layers. First of all, people are less willing to access things such as official medical institutions, for example, hospitals. B, there's less internal investment, for example, from government, because now everyone doesn't give a shit about that. So there's just less investment into things such as hospital and whatnot. And C, we think that there's just less external investment, because if no one uses a service, no companies want to fucking invest in your country because you don't use those hospitals anyway. So the problem is that they have less medical access. They have things such as diseases that are harder to solve in the first place. Thirdly, there's less internal political stability, because when there's more oppression on their side of the house, there's probably more things such as protests. There's probably things such as citizens being pissed off about this. So even if at some point they can't tolerate this, at some point in time, if not now then in the future, they're probably going to revolt that causes internal political stability, such as the one we see in Peru. Fourth thing, we think that international image in general, you're just going to be sanctioned more by Western bodies, for example, United States and whatnot. On our side of the house, there's a trend towards progressivism, because first of all, Europe, the area that actually conceptualized Catholicism is actually becoming more progressive. That's just the empirical reality. And second of all, you have a lot of trends that on their side of the house are going to be suppressed. So you have more conservatism and more people suffer on opposition. On all of those grounds, we're proud to win from an opening government.
Of opposition for that fine speech. Now I'd like to call upon the DPM. Here.
Right, am I audible? Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Right, give me a second. All right. Do I verbalize? Religion is very, very different from running a company. We are going to run very, very simple things. Firstly, I'm going to give you three flips on why competition on their side, i.e. religious competition on their side, actually makes things worse, actually makes people in more crisis and more identity and belief crisis, actually makes the religion weaker, actually makes the progressive interpretation worse on their side, and why we should respect this right. Secondly, we are going to debate on the delta, which is centralized religion or decentralized religion, which is a better counterfactual for the Latin America. Because notice this debate is not about a world where we have Pentecostalism versus a world where we have liberal or we have no religion at all, right? It's a world where we have the rise of Pentecostalism and the world when we have Catholic as a dominant religion. So that is the second thing that we are going to debate on. Thirdly, will be our extension on minorities, on the poor people, and why they are going to be so much worse on opposition side. Firstly, on competition, why do we think that competition actually makes things worse? Three layers. Firstly, competitions makes the level of progressive interpretation worse, because on that side, what the local priests are going to do, or what the priests of Pentecostalism are going to do, is they're going to change their belief, or they're going to change the way that a Christian is being they change the way that Christianity is going to be spread in order to fit in the local belief, or in order to fit in the indigenous people belief. Why is this going to be bad? Because let's remember, most indigenous people, or most these local people believe are going to be very, very traditional, since the indigenous people in Latin America often don't really have enough exposure to westernization, don't have exposure to a lot of these progressive beliefs. So therefore, if you do compete and you cater to that belief, it's very, very likely that those progressive interpretation of the West is not going to be able to persuade them. It's very, very likely that these local priests are going to sway and going to change their belief in order to persuade these local people. Why does that change on outside? Because let's remember here, the Catholic system is a very centralized system. It is a system where local priests, or local priests or traditional priests, still have to listen to the Pope, or have to listen to the leaders, to the Vatican of the West. This is very, very likely that even if they want to cater to the traditional belief, or cater to the traditional people, to the local people, they still have to listen to the progressive interpretation of the West, or the progressive interpretation of the Pope. So that is why it's very likely that on our side there's more progressive interpretation, because we have more centralized religion, and because we don't have this mechanism of competition on their side. That's the first layer. Second layer here, competition is worse because when there are a lot of people, when there are a lot of religions joining, or especially when there are a lot of religions trying to say that they have a different interpretation of Christianity, it makes people have more identity crisis and belief crisis. Because now people don't really understand that, oh, there are just so many ways to interpret the God, or the word of God. So whether my way of living, or my way of believing God is true or not, which is the way that we are able to get into access to the word of God the most. So this is very, very likely that on your side, people have an identity crisis, or whenever they don't really know which one is a true one, or which is a path that actually gives them the enlightenment and gives them the actual way to receive and to understand the word of God, and to receive the divine power, right? On that side, that's a problem. On our side, what is the delta here is like when we have only the long dominance of Catholicism. This is when people have a very consistent belief, or consistent identity that, yeah, this is the way, this is the consistent and the right way for us to achieve the word of God, to achieve the preaching of God, or to achieve, and to go to heaven. And that is when people actually have more belief in religion. Why is this very, very important? Because two things. Firstly, religion is not going to be strong if people don't really believe in it in the first place, right? The core of religion is to give you the idea that you can be enlightened, is to give you the idea that if you believe in this path of life, that you can have the enlightenment of yourself. So this is very likely that on their side, because of the identity crisis and the belief crisis, people will leave religion, or people will start to stop donating to religion, because they don't really believe that it is the right way, and they doubt that whether this is the true way to achieve the enlightenment from God. Only outside, people have more incentive to actually donate. People have more incentive to engage in religion more, because people have a consistent belief in this religion, and that's why it works. That's the second layer. The third layer here is that the religion gets worse on your side, because let's remember here, most Catholic Church right now receive a lot of help from the Pope, or receive a lot of help from also Western Catholic churches, right? The mechanism of belief is that if your church is going to have a lot of people there, then you get a lot of support. The problem here is that the Catholic Church or opposition gets so much weaker because people start transition to Pentecostalism, and it makes its church a lot weaker and gets a lot less support. And that's why, and how we flip the case of competition. For any POIs.
So is the Pope woke because he's combating Pentecostalism, or because he's combating atheism? Why the fuck is this so important for the globe?
I don't understand here because I think that we have already told you that the difference on your side is that there is a rise of another way to understand, another way to interpret Christianity, and that's why it creates all these problems I just say. Now, second extension on here, which is about why on opposition side you are more likely to force minority to be blamed, and the minority is going to have less support on your side. Let's remember here is that things such as drug users, such as gangs in Latin America, don't exist because people are addicted, but it exists because one, people lack external help and the donation to actually get out of it, and two, people lack the external support for them to actually escape from this addiction. Why is this worse on their side? It is worse on their side because Pentecostalism always blame these people for their personal behavior, always blame them. It's like, yeah, if you are addicted, you are a very bad person, you are a very very uncivilized individual, and it just makes these people more likely to have less support, more likely to get more blame for the Pentecostalism supporters. The delta here is very simple. Catholicism don't blame individual for this. Catholic, they are more likely to encourage donation. They're more likely to have a more forgiving approach to these people, and that's when these people have more external support, have more external forgiveness from other, from the close one as well. And that is actually when these addicted people can reintegrate into society and becomes better people. Why is impact very, very important? It's very, very important because on their side, it just makes the vulnerable of the vulnerable even worse. It makes the problem here even worse on their side. We insist to make it very, very simple. Firstly, we prove by competition is very, very bad on their side. Secondly, we prove on by protect the minorities. Firstly, we still have the case about soft conflicts, about mobilized resources. We just haven't really engaged anything in the PM, so that's why we win.
I'd like to thank DPM for that fine speech. Now to close off the top half, I'd like to invite DLO. Here.
Am I audible?
Yes.
All right, just a second. We are starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, governments try to claim that the Vatican, the Catholic Church, is not a business. I don't know how to call an international organization that controls real estate all across the world, that operates hospitals and schools all across the world, and controls the vast majority of money through donations because everyone needs to pay a tithe, like a tenth of their salary, to the Catholic Church. Any believer basically has to do. So they control a huge amount of capital all across the world, and they have the capacity to distribute it in order to maintain their interest, which is maximizing believers. This is a business whose whole point is salvation, and their point of salvation is making sure that many people believe in them as possible. So we think that this is a business, and we are going to engage with the points why competition is good in this consent, and then explain to you simply, even if why Pentecostals are simply like better system of faith than Catholics. But let's start from engaging with the main claims they are getting. In terms of conservatives, I'm conceding with CO basically. What's the difference between the Catholic Church and the Pentecostals? They believe in the same God. They are both relatively conservatives. There's a small margin of how much they can liberalize anyway. So we don't think it happens there. We think that the competition, if anything, incentivizes more liberalization due to the unique capacity that the Latin American cardinals have, and the more access they have in the Vatican in order to influence its actions and reforms. But still, we think that the margin is relatively small. Or the thing about minorities, the vast majority of Latin America was already basically Christianized by conquest and colonialism and conquistadors. Very few indigenous people still maintain their faith, and those minorities are either very isolated or are going to be both sides are going to try and basically evangelize them and convert them because both sides try to maximize believers. So both the Catholics and the Pentecostals have the incentive to do the same thing. They are not effective, and they are a minority compared to Eugene back to describing to there. Now, in terms of the accountability that I'm telling you, I don't understand why the larger, more centralized organization that controls the whole world is more accountable compared to your local community, which you can affect, and the priest that you can actually control directly. This is exactly why in our side of the house, it's very easy to move from one congregation to another between the Pentecostals, and the Catholics must fight on your faith or try to recruit people by changing their behaviors, like being more liberal or giving you more money. So this is why we give a unique way, because all of the conservatives are basically trapped, because it's very hard to become more conservative than the Pentecostals. Their only way to gain more believers is by approaching atheism and becoming more liberals. So this is basically for them. Again, the extent is not very significant there, but it still exists. So we think that simply have more accountability because the communities are smaller and the pastor is more localized and controlled by you in the Pentecostals compared to the huge church, and only the competition is the only capacity to do so. In this regard, the church is an hegemony. hegemony. It controls the vast majority of the population, and as such, they think, they need us completely. We don't need to really fight over them. However, the friction that they are describing and continue to you means that the Catholic Church loses faith. It means that it must look, and because it doesn't have the capacity to use violence, at all, because basically, like there is a separation between state and religion to a significant extent, and most of the power is found by the state. We don't think it is able to use violence, and it must use other means, such as prioritizing donations to Latin America and the developing world because of it. POIs, 3, 2, 1. I'll continue. Now, in this regard, why does impact so important? Because the church has tons of money and he has like losing faithful anywhere. In the West, it doesn't have many like opponents because it basically the Protestantism is very weak in most countries, not mention that they need to deal with atheism. So it needs to decide whether to put the money in the West or in Latin America. If all of them remain Catholics, it means that, again, it's very hard and they are very conservative overall and they are very unlikely to liberalize very quickly. It means that the Catholic Church doesn't have the incentive to give them donations. It prioritizes the West. It prioritizes more churches there, giving them more donations to the poor in the West, like trying to invest in this local infrastructure and open borders and even do more PR in the West. But if it thinks it's going to lose the vast majority of its believers that are found in the South, and the only reason they're going to move is from Pentecostals to the Catholics, this is when they're going to give more donations, open more hospitals, invest in infrastructure in donations and things like that. The church has the capacity and the incentive only outside of the house. Yes, POI. I can't hear you. I'll continue. Okay. With this in mind, we simply think that it's the only capacity to give donations, and the only capacity to create competition against the hegemony that happens in Latin America, and the only capacity to move donations from the West to South America. Now, let's talk about why, even if you don't buy it, why simply Pentecostalism is a better system of faith. Now, while they come and claim from Open Government about cognitive dissonance and lack sense of identity, again, the difference between God it's the same God. The difference between system of faith is relatively small. The main question is who can do miracles, either the priest or like God and very few saints. So you have the more democratization of priests and more democratization of miracles in the side of Pentecostals. And all the point about like syncretism happens in both sides. Folk Christians and like folk Catholics that are based, folk saints that are based on pagan gods have been incorporated to the Catholic Church ever since it was created, and it didn't create a significant cognitive dissonance. So we think the impact there is very small. However, what is important in terms of the Catholics, how do you communicate with God? You communicate through sacraments. It means that the priest comes and gives you like the holy bread, wine, and you need to participate in the ceremonies. You need to only the saints can connect you to God. It always separates you. You need to learn theology in order to properly understand God. It's very inaccessible for the vast majority of the church, and you only depend on the priest as the only key to God. You're only local key to God because only the Pope have the authority to connect to God. Basically, you never feel God, and you always never know what he wants. It means you're completely dependent on the local priest. You're completely dependent on their desires, and you can't move. Regardless of where you move, there's no competition between congregations of the Catholic Church because they all operate under the same values and the same system. So it means that in outside the house, you are constantly fearing that you don't really understand God because you can't connect to him. You have a lacking sense of meaning, and you're always afraid that you're not in the grace of God because you don't know if you're in the grace of God. By canon of the Catholic Church, you don't know if you can be in the grace of God. So there's constant fear that you are not loved by God, and it means that you're not sure that you're going to go to heaven, or you're always afraid you're going to go to hell. What happens in outside the house? You feel God. God happens because everyone can do miracles. Everyone who is baptized by the Holy Spirit, and all believers are baptized, are able to feel God and able to enter to trance. This is how they speak in tongues. They basically learn how to enter to trance, start speaking in tongues, and believe it is a sign of God. You feel it in your eyes and you see it. You see your priest go to his trance and you see them as a messenger for God. You can do it yourself, and that you can feel God through you and within you. So you know you have the blessing of God at any point. It means you remove the major fear that you are going to hell because you know you are found in God's grace. You see, either you yourself or the priest are committing those stuff and are able to go through those trances, and as such you see God within your eyes. It's physical to you, and it's feelings you connect to it, and you can feel it within your heart. It means you are never afraid to go to hell. You get a sense of meaning to it. This is why Pentecostalism is a better religion compared to Catholicism. To the point that generally support Catholics, but it's a fun thing. Anyway, thank you. I need to leave, but good luck for everyone.
I'd like to thank DLO for a fine speech. Thought it was a fine top half. To open up back half, I'd like to invite member of Gov. Here.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much. I'll be accepting POIs through the chat and through the Zoom reactions. I'll be starting my speech shortly. Three, two, one. Panel, as the Latin America team in the round, I'm going to give you context on what actually happened, what Dvij says here. This is not a debate about religion. This is about a debate on how, in the 1960s, dictatorships massively invested in Pentecostalism in the structures of power and made them the problem that they are today, which they continually support and radicalize people towards the far right and actually make moral conservatism significantly worse in our account, especially not only for the minorities, but also in keeping the polarized system and now in the constant shift that we have between far left and far right regimes in Latin America and how bad it is for the population. 2 points here, firstly, on how this rise actually happens. Notice that what we had in the 1960s is actually that at the point the dictatorships were happening and they were rising, they actually boycotted and put out the Catholic Church and chose Pentecostalism instead for two main reasons. Firstly, because at the time, we had the extension and the rising of the theology of liberation, which was mainly an ideology that tried to mix Marxist ideas with the Catholic Church in the sense of defending the interests of the poor. And a lot of priests, for instance, in Bolivia or like in Brazil and a lot of countries in Latin America, were actually defending ideas that were portrayed as being Marxist or being more left-leaning. And more often, they were also like fighting towards like student groups and student student movements towards political and more political measures for the poor and also against oppressive regimes in general. That means that for the regime that was now ascending as dictatorship, they didn't kind of like that priests could be used as the means of like maintaining the population in control because they fear that we're actually being contaminated by the left-leaning ideologies. But secondly, because by the way that these both solutions work, since priests in Catholic Church tend to be more centralized in hierarchies, it's also more of an uncertainty if the priests, when you entrench them into the political power as a means of manipulating the masses, if they will actually follow the interests of the dictatorship to the long run. Because the loyalty of the priests, in most of the cases, will stand with the Pope of the Archbishop, not of the dictator politician, or the dictator politician in those times. So they prefer actually go to those that don't have those hierarchical things. That's why in the 1960s, 1970s, in Brazil, when we have the March of Family with God for Liberty, ironic name for the march that actually defended the installation of the dictatorship, it were the Pentecostals doing it and not the Catholic Church, because those were actually the ones that were feeling more usable by dictatorships. This already deals massively with the fantasy that OOs tried to sell you on the free market of religions, because this wasn't a fair competition. They were instilled and they created a monopoly and instilled into in the structures of power by the dictatorships. And what we have today is the unfortunate leftover of all of the resources and all of the political influence that they built upon those times. Why then specifically we think that it is significantly worse than in the way that this rise is specifically or happened in that regard. Firstly, they were established as political economical elites. Notice that these days, in many Latin American countries, we still have entire political parties that are tied to Pentecostal ideas. We call them like the Bible bench, for instance, in Brazil, or in similar names in other Latin American countries. That means that in the comparative here, actually, before that, we didn't have things like the Catholic Church and being entrenched in the political parties. At most, what we had is, for instance, Catholic Church instilling some kind of conservatism like more religions, and that affecting voters. But notice how that is significantly different from having priests being inside of the political parties, voting and proposing changes inside of the government, and how there's a more direct violation of the secular state principle as a whole. This is what happens, and is a holdover from when the Pentecostal priests and the Pentecostal churches were inserted into the structures of power in dictatorships and were never removed until then. But also, secondly, because they also, during all of those time, were able to amass significant large of capital. Silas Malafaia guy in Brazil is basically a millionaire who invests and have millionaire churches who are like bigger than like some shopping malls and that do like shows all over the time. They are individuals that today hold a significant consequential power and capability of mobilizing the masses towards their agendas. And the reason why they need to do this and why this is specific to the rise of the Pentecostal churches is because they need and they want to maintain the power that they gain through the dictatorship. Which brings us to my second point. Why then they tend to be more conservative and tend more to radicalization? Because compared to what the Catholic priests, or every Catholic priest would do, the Catholic Church would do, they weren't and will never be as entrenched into the political structures and the ideologies. This is something that is mainly fault of the rise of these Pentecostal churches in Latin America as a whole. That means that on the counterfactual, we never had these priests or these religious people be as entrenched into the political system and into the state in decision making, but also didn't have the same incentives to be to defend themselves in that regard. We think that actually it's more likely than that if the Catholic Church didn't lose that much of power, they would still keep in the logic of the theology of liberation. They would still be more, like mobilizing resistance movements way more effectively. And to this day, actually, they would tend to be surprisingly more progressive leaning than the Pentecostals as a whole. Before I move on, open your position.
Look, this is this House regrets motion. You don't change what happened in the past. What is comparative in this debate is that we don't really require free competition. We just require competition for the Catholic Church to become better. All of our analysis
motion is analyzing like a hypothetical scenario when things like didn't happen. So I don't know how to engage with this POI. I'm so sorry. So when do we expect to have more conservatism and more radicalization then? Notice that as well, we have this concentrated in significant individuals that have incentive to do that. The impacts on this then is that a lot of the bills currently that we try to press in progressive manners, such as minority rights and etc., get significantly more blockage inside of the Congress because now they are entrenched into the political power. Again, in the counterfactual, the Catholic Church wouldn't have managed the same regard, would at most be staying as an outside influencing how people think about the matter, but not an inside blockage in like being able to block something, or even like staying in the bureaucratic process into like adjourning votings into matters and etc. But also secondly, they have an interest of always tying themselves up and continuing the narratives of messianism that actually put some of the far right candidates into a better spotlight. This is what led to the election of Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, a far right politician, because they mainly use those structures to also elect themselves and to mobilize the population into the more reactive and conservative ideas against the democratic state. So the same population that is then later used to bring back the gays and glorify the military dictatorship as a whole. Notice then that it's only because of this rise that these politicians managed to have such a significant capacity to have a chokehold in the population, and how we build a feedback loop, which is basically impossible for us to fight against conservatism and way worse for the minorities to actually get the changes that they need to have a good life in those countries. Proud to propose.
I'd like to thank Member of Gov for that fine speech. Now I'd like to invite Member of Up. Hear, hear.
Audible and stuff, I imagine, yeah. Okay. I think not doing drugs is a good thing. This is going to be the CO case on why vice is bad, simple case. Let's deal with the rest of the case in the round before we get to that. Okay, I will deal first with CG. I will say the following for CG. I love them. Like, if we don't win, they should win. The case is amazing in fact. Great. There's a gigantic problem though. They say, the incentive analysis is like dictatorships going into power. This dictatorship is going to fuck up the system because Catholics don't like them. Therefore, they instituted the Pentecostalism. The problem with CG is, so what is the counterfactual? The incentive of the dictatorship remains the same for all military dictatorships. Therefore, they have the two options. Either import another religion that is not Pentecostalism, and they will have the same right-wing bias in order for them to support the church and support the dictatorship, or B, to actively, violently crack down on the Catholic Church, which is probably way worse. Like, since this counterfactual is probably the dictatorship in itself, imprisoning Catholics, etc., and for them to not support the church, etc. I think that the problem in CG then, with this lack of counterfactual, is immense. Because when they say Jair Bolsonaro was elected because of the rise of Pentecostalism, the beliefs and supporters of the old dictatorships probably would have other similar religions or other political incentives, propaganda from the US to back them. Therefore, since there is this gigantic problem-solution mismatch in CG, they cannot take the case of, yes, we solve far-right in Brazil, like this is crazy. Okay, going into the rest of the thing. Competition with the Catholic Church is insignificant to the round. Two reasons for this. The first is because priests believe in their own doctrine, therefore they're likely to espouse their doctrine independent of other churches existing. So if I, as a Catholic, want to help kids to not die, so they go into paradise, I will continue and maintain the previous funding I have, so they don't die. Plus B, I will say the very following, most of these are humanitarian processes that happen globally. Notice, the debate is not an actor motion. If a team is arguing that you remove funding from one part of the world to invest in hospitals in Latin America, the other part of the world is losing hospitals. Therefore, probably more money to Latin America is not a positive impact in the round. Then lastly, I will say the following. The biggest competitor globally to the Catholic Church is atheism. This is because there is a massive rise of atheism, both in Europe but also globally. This is why Pope Francis became more woke. This is why popes in general have become more woke in order to deter people from leaving the Catholic Church. Therefore, both top-half teams that are arguing whether the Catholic Church becomes more aggressive or not, Pentecostalism is probably way, way down the ladder of incentives. Therefore, probably they're not able to have the tipping point to prove, oh, now the Catholic Church becomes woke. There are multiple other incentives why that's the case. Going to the case, Pentecostalism is thus good, okay? Why is moral conservatism good? So firstly, we'll deal with the vices and drugs and alcohol and smoking. I think two things on this. One, consuming less vice is good. This is because you're less likely to get addicted to drugs, less likely to get addicted to alcohol. Notice, Latin American countries have huge income disparities and also tend to have very poor populations, with also an increase in alcohol and drug consumption. This means that you want to disincentivize people for consuming these drugs. We believe that the highest form of incentive is eternal punishment to hell, or to that degree, it is less likely to consume drugs in the first place. The biggest response from governments is in DPM, where they say, oh, but stigma is bad, because you stigmatize people from being themselves and consuming these drugs. Two cases on this. The first is, let's assume that the stigma is bad. This stigma also proves that some people will abide by the stigma, and therefore they will not consume drugs, alcohol, and smoking. This means then that less people will be affected by these vices. And I want you to note that these vices are crippling. Like alcohol addiction, for example, in Greece, which is also a highly religious society, is high. Many people are losing their families, losing their income, either on drugs, etc. But B, it also creates immense health complications. So if there are some addicts in opposition that are taking these substances but are stigmatized, they will feel worse, we believe their pain is insignificant to the number of people that we are decreasing from getting this in the first place. The second part of this case is probably the Pentecostalist church offers rehab and offers ways for you to deter and become morally conservative. The reason for this is because the communal church that wants people to ascend and go to heaven. Therefore, you just stigmatize people for not being morally conservative, but you try to guide them to being morally conservative. This means that you're more likely to open rehab centers that are Pentecostal. This means you're more likely to do this. Why this doesn't happen in the Catholic Church? Two things. One, the Catholic Church is way less cracked down on sins. There's two reasons for this. One, because you can literally buy off your sins in Catholicism to priests, either through confession, and therefore your sins are no longer as important, or be literally we don't know how it's called in English, but you can literally pay the Catholic Church for you to have sins. This means then that the alcohol, etc., is less important. B, if the info slides grant that this is an explicitly crucial part of Catholicism, probably it is not the same for Catholicism. Before I move on, opening government.
People don't do drugs because of this stigma, not people do it because there's no external help and there's no way for them to escape. So how do you engage with this?
Yeah, but the way to escape is the church then, because you're not forced to do drugs. You do drugs because you want to escape reality, but then the church offers meaning. Now getting this part of the case. Why is deeper connection not good? Notice that DLO says, you have closer connection because Holy Spirit, whatever. The real reason why you have closer connection to God is because per the info slide, it is a non-organized, non-centralized church. This means that it is easier for you to find your own meaning through the church and your own meaning through the values. Notice, especially through moral conservatism, it means you're way more likely to espouse beliefs deeply because you have shifted your way of life. This means then that one, the afterlife gains way more purpose in your own life. Therefore, the own struggles that you face are less likely to be important to you. This is why, one, people are less likely to opt into drugs in this case scenario because they believe that religion itself is probably a large drug for them in the first place. But B, probably pleasure is immense from having emotional prayer as per the info slide. Therefore, you don't have to go towards the path of sin. This only happens through the right, but more people are Pentecostal and not Catholic. Therefore, we believe that it's simply good for less people to consume alcohol, less people to consume drugs. Vote CO, clean case.
I'd like to thank Member of Up for that fine speech. Now I'd like to invite Gov Whip. Here.
We can't hear you, Gov.
Is Gov Whip here?
I think he left the call. He might rejoin.
Okay, we'll give him a sec.
Okay, hopefully you can hear me now.
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, great. Thank you. And I wanted to apologize to the DLO as well for the failure in attempting a POI. Sorry for the delay. I'll begin in 5 seconds. The problem with CO's attacks to your case is that either importing a different religion or directly oppressing the Catholic Church would never work in Latin America. A couple of reasons for this. Note that religion, and in particular Christianism in Latin America, it's much more than just religion, but a cultural phenomenon that is deeply rooted in the identity of the people. They might not go to church every Sunday, and they don't, and Catholicism is in a decay, but at the same time, it's the name of over 50% of the cities in most of the countries in Latin America. It's in the tattoos of every footballer you know coming from South America. And it's deeply rooted in the culture and how people manifest their identity and their ties to that place. What this really means is that you can't really import a different religion because the values of Christianity are deeply rooted into the people. And you can't oppress a Catholic because people would perceive this as being a direct oppression of Christianity. The point then is that the Pentecostalism is particularly convenient to the use of the dictatorships, as Member explains, because it is both directly tied to the Christian values, but it is also evangelizing. It is not associated with the vertical structure of the church, which would bring the ties from Vatican, and it's particularly useful to mobilize for political action because of the personalistic pastors, priests, and different other institutions inside of this church. What this really means then is that the Pentecostal was a particularly useful means for the dictatorship to perpetuate those values that now shape Latin American politics. Why then is the politics the most relevant impact in this round? Let's analyze what CO builds in constructive. They say that the moral conservatism is good because vices are bad and we want to stop this. A couple of responses to this will already show you why it's more relevant to talk about politics. First, notice that this abstract connection to Christianity, which in here we call the IBGE Catholics, are already taking care of the perception of people of vices. People already have this, I wouldn't go so far as call it a stigma, but definitely a regression and a perception of being those vices as bad and actually like promoting some sort of repudiation against them. The comparative then is that they say that the Pentecostal at least offer rehab, but the problem with this is that it shows to you why the politics is being shifted from the state towards this religion. Notice that the issue is that the Pentecostals offer rehab in a patronizing fashion, both because of the miraculous savings that they offer and because of the structure, as the different priests have to compete, as all mechanizes for us, apparently. There's this very strong need for the priests to compete and to offer more and more drastic solutions to the problems. The millionaires, my member tells you, can build shopping malls, huge constructions to attract the people. But they are not all of the Pentecostals. The lower tier of Pentecostals, which still have followers, have to appeal to this more drastic, sometimes conflicting with science solution that appeals to these people to actually go to the church. Notice then that on weighing, note how it is dangerous to have a whole parliamentary bench thinking that the solution to chemical dependence is a miraculous saving you can find at the church, that they sell the services and that they profit from building those malls. So it's not an efficient way to actually solve chemical dependence. On the contrary, and an intuition pumping here, the pandemic in COVID-19, Bolsonaro and all of the similar far-right politicians that emerged from this narrative my member tells you were anti-vax and directly promoting alternative treatments because it is rooted in the narrative that actually it's not about the medicine, it is about being with God, following the paths that they tell you. What this shows then is how crucial our impact is in the round, because it shapes not just the perception or the identity or the community of the people, but actually their safety, the protection of the minorities, and all of the groups who are affected by having such strong political figures in parliament. I'll take up your wife from opening.
Look, because of the financial help from the church on our side of the house, you do solve all of these problems, even on our side of the house. But secondly, when the CIA and the entire world capital is behind these dictatorships, they anyway happen. So your delta is very little, if anything, in this debate.
Well, first, on Catholics building more churches, hospitals, schools. This happens in the 16th century, but it has only decayed ever since. Note that they are defending the status quo. It is not enough to say that the church had the incentives to invest if they cannot prove that the investment happened. If the intuition you have is that of the Catholic father in Brazil suffering political tensions and actually a potential harm of being arrested for distributing free meals to the homeless people in the streets, then you shouldn't consider that the church is actually so powerful in promoting that sort of thing. On the CIA aspect, sure, the funds might come from abroad, but the dictatorship in those Latin American countries still needed an internal way to perpetuate their power, to not suffer from the repression or the movement or the mobilization of the people. The way that they did this in the past was by instrumentalizing the tight connections that people had to Christian identity by diverting the ideology into what was convenient to them. So it is not enough for you to just assert that there was money coming from abroad and they would find a way if the only actual way that is likely to have occurred comes directly from shaping the march that my member tells you into actually mobilizing the people in favor of the regime. Secondly, when they talk about investments and rights as an exclusive thing, it is not. No, two things. First, the incentive for these Pentecostal leaders to actually build these pharaonic buildings and constructions to actually appeal for the people reverts in investment, true, in competition, true, but in a patronizing fashion that brings all of these externalities. Even if they're right, on Wayne, it is really clear why you shouldn't prioritize this sort of investment if it comes with political ties and affiliation of the people. Second, notice that when you have more and more of this investment and this presence, there's more abstract promises emerging, which only feedbacks this loop. And this construction on why is the political relevance just so impactful in the ground is a much bigger impact that you should weigh much higher than what OG only tells you, that is the mental confusion on doctrine and the community fragmentation that might emerge from this religion. Thanks.
I'd like to thank Gov-Whip for that fine speech, and now to conclude their case and the debate as a whole, I'd like to invite Opposition Whip. Hear.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Perfect. I'm trying to open my cam again. Tell me if camera disrupts audio or it's only that like the video freezes.
I think the video is disrupting a little bit. I don't know if anyone else from panel can comment.
If it doesn't disrupt my audio, I'm perfect.
The audio sounds clear to me.
Okay, cool. POI is anyway except chat. I won't be looking at that. Responding to Gov-Whip, they have one thing, that you need, that these people need science in order to avoid drugs because anti-drug policy in this country is already strong enough. Not this, this is entirely mitigatory. As in, they say we don't give as much benefit as we're telling. This doesn't prove we give less benefit than what we're proving. This is inherently mitigatory. I pose the question to Gov-Whip. How would in their side, you cause people to follow science? They haven't explained to me which alternative that's likely to happen in the counterfaction would be able to push science as the way to go about going anti-drugs. But also, this is Pentecostalist, this is not Jehovah's Witnesses. We're not telling you don't do DNRs or you don't take blood. You're just praying. You can also do some kind of ritual. The structural reason behind this is because Pentecostalism is a branch of Protestant church. Protestant is one of the latest kinds of Christianity to exist. Therefore, they're much more likely to follow positive reinforcements as opposed to Catholics because they had to deviate significantly from Catholicism at the time they were brought up. This means you have few incentives to push people to only to pray. You have more incentives to let your people follow. This also is because if you're a small church, you don't want your people to die in Latin America. Therefore, you push them to do not only praying but other things. Lastly, this is inherently, this is inherently mitigatory. Then, dealing with the POI from opening government, you're forced to consume drugs. This is insane. You're not forced to consume drugs during your life. You're forced to find solace because of your life. There's an inherent difference. You choose into taking drugs. I have two responses. One, that Pentecostalism are better than Catholics because of positive reinforcement. Catholics tell you will burn to hell unless you stop doing that or you pay us $50 to get the forgiveness paper. We tell you that you should speak with God and you should be able to go against this, and here's the way to create this. Secondly, consuming drugs may be symmetric, but the likelihood of creating health centers increases Notice, God concedes that you are more persuasive than Catholics because you have to increase your audience. Therefore, you must more likely to be able to create the health centers. Here I will flag with OO. OO says you create health centers for Catholics. This is one, uncertain. Two, zero sum for world, because this health center would be in Africa or be in Asia at the same time. Of the comparative, Pentecostalist church has one is decentralized, so the resources are not able to transfer to the globe, but two, they have incentive to have uniquely Latin America. Third response to consuming drugs. There is no punishment from the Catholics in the interim. I don't know, like I have never understood why, if Catholics would be able to fix this problem, it would have been solved at the 70s. The Pentecostalists have helped in reducing also. That's it. Let's go with opening government. So I have one case that you lose access to God. Both are Christianities. Both have God. I fail to understand why you going Pentecostals is worse because you lose access. This is insane. But if anything, you increase access to God because of more choices. Maybe the Catholic punishing God is not good for me, but the Pentecostalist God is better. So we increase access to God because some who turn atheists may now turn Pentecostals. Then they say that this affects conflict between people. One, in families, you have high chance of keeping the same religion through bloodlines because you have a lot of same upbringing. This means that at best, this is one generation of conflict with their parents. This is inherently short-term. The next generation would remain Pentecostals. Two, there's two. Everyone has the same cultural knowledge of Catholicism. Therefore, you can speak day to day with anyone because you were brought up in a also Catholic part, so you also know what to say and what to describe. Not every conversation boils down to if you are or Pentecostalist or Catholic. But three, there are so many other reasons to a conflict. I don't know. My neighbor may be screwing my wife and I will be mad at him. I'm quoting, I am sorry. But like I don't know why this specific reason to create conflict is so big in Latin America that this counts everything. So then, the only way for OG to win is if they accept that Catholicism is the one true God. This is insane, and this is also linked to the second case that, Catholicism are less conservative, and something that came up in the 60s. This is crazy, right? Women have rights. Women that cannot divorce from Catholic Church have more rights in Catholic Church. This is inherently disruptive. I don't think they have ever been able to prove why Catholic is less conservative. But you have explained to you why Catholicism is less likely to change. Because one, Latin America isn't the part that is uniquely able to change the whole system of Catholicism because it's a very big hierarchy. But two, you need to be strict to the dogma because this is the thing that has allowed you as an institution to continue existing. Therefore, you're unable to get outside of your dogma, even if you would have wanted to do in some parts. The comparison is, if a part of the decentralized Pentecostal church wants to change the dogma, they have the capacity to do more freely as compared to Catholics. Therefore, you're uniquely more able to be progressive in opposition. The weighing then is on conflicts versus dependency on substances. One, taking out of drugs is irreversible. If you're hooked, it's significantly more irreversible as compared to arguing with your mother. Secondly, the exclusivity. Substances can be reduced uniquely to religion as CG framing, or the comparative conflicts can be reduced by many things. Maybe go to therapy. At the end of the day, we extend to get access to the God is the same. You have less substance abuse. You have more access to new ideas of progressivism. Therefore, OG is out. Before I deal with the remaining of CG, anybody from opening? Closing. No. Opening. Go. Anyway, I don't know. Okay. OCG, they say that these things are set up from immoral actors, as if the Catholicism wasn't set up by colonialists in Latin America, which are equally immoral actors, making the Catholic Church in Latin America equally immoral. Then they say that, like we have explained, these actors are likely to weaponize anything to come into power. Why then is weaponizing Pentecostalism uniquely good? The alternatives are either the Catholic Church follows me, so these dictators get more power because they have wider approach to citizens, or they crack down on the Catholic Church because they go against them, because more people are getting harmed, or they use cartels and fear in order to get power. This is inherently more problematic, but at the same time, this lacks all the moral and health benefits that Pentecostalism provides. Then they say that Pentecostalism is uniquely capable to do this. They have to prove when the counterfactual dictators wouldn't be able to get power. Because they haven't done, therefore they cannot say that because this was the thing they used now, it would have done in the comparative. I have just explained to you why this is the best alternative of using a new religion as compared to Catholicism, that who had more appeal to dictators, therefore more power into them. The way is simply, one, on likelihood. The likelihood of dictatorship is immense. The likelihood of getting more solace is small. Therefore, when you are able to get solace on our side, this is unique on our side, they will still get dictators. But secondly, we provide solace in a better way because Catholics now can oppose the dictators on their side. They will either be cracked down or following the dictators. No benefit, no opposition, proud CEO.
I'd like to thank Upwit for that fine speech, for what was overall an enjoyable debate. We'll go deliberate. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for the debate, guys. Good luck.
Thanks, everyone.
Sorry, could all the debaters leave, please? Also, could we cut the recording as well, please?
Yeah, I'll do that.